All right, our guest is Dylan Nadler. He's a professional mental coach to world champion athletes and the founder of MindLock. How you doing, sir?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for having me, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm actually really looking forward to interviewing you. You're the first professional mental coach I'm actually interviewing, and I have a lot of questions to ask you. And I'm going to jump right into it by asking you this one. What's the most challenging aspect of your job as a mental coach, and how do you overcome this particular challenge?
Yeah, that's a good one. Getting right into it, eh? Um, I think there's challenges that you expect, and I think there's challenges that you don't necessarily expect. I mean, the ones that you expect are definitely being able to work with athletes through kind of unique situations, right? Eh, everyone's coming from a different place, right? Different histories, different backgrounds, different, career pathways. So, I think that's one challenge that is tough, but you expect it is, how do you navigate each person's kind of individual experience to get the most out of them? Because there's no such thing as like a cookie cutter model that would work for everybody. So I think one challenge is trying to figure out, how do you personalize things in a way where everyone's getting value out of it? That's not just generalized. And that's the challenge that you expect. Challenge that I didn't necessarily expect was kind of navigating and managing people from kind of all over the world, right? So because this is such kind of a global business, I have clients everywhere from, Canada, US, but then as far as, Australia,
Wow.
Thailand, Indonesia, right? So time differences become a factor. So, we're not just talking about, East Coast versus West Coast. We're talking like 14, 13 hours, ahead and behind sometimes. So from an organizational standpoint, sometimes trying to understand when someone says, there's 1 p.m. work, it's like, okay, doing the math of like, well, what does that mean for here? So, that's one of the challenges that I didn't necessarily anticipate was like,
Right.
working with people, obviously, and it's a blessing too to have that big of an outreach, but at the same time, definitely kind of keeps me on my toes trying to figure out, where people are at and how to, do what's best for them in their own time. So there'll be times where I'll be running a session with an athlete and it's like midnight, my time because it
Right.
just works better for them. And those are the sacrifices that you make, but I'm happy to do it.
Fascinating. It sounds like you have, a global audience, as far as athletes. It's not just in Canada, US, as you mentioned, you have people all over the world, which leads to this follow-up question, if you don't mind me asking, because I find, by the way, you have a lot of great content online, a lot of great interviews, and I have a lot to ask in a short time. So I'll try to hammer you with a bunch of questions. Follow up here in terms of the cultural. So how do you navigate with the fact that you're dealing with people that are from all over the world? What role does culture play into that? But the reason why I ask that is if you have clients from, say, outside of North America, that you say English is not their first language, and well, that's the linguistic issue. But as far as cultural norms, as it comes in relation to sports culture and how one trains and the relationship between a coach and a student and all that. Can you tell us a bit about how culture could be potentially an opportunity or a hurdle or both maybe?
Yeah, I mean, both kind of globally and even locally. I mean, between, even in US and Canada, people have different approaches based off of how they were raised or how they were brought up or where they're from. The concept of, mental coaching or mental training for some can be kind of off-putting or even daunting. It's like, well, what's that mean, right? I mean, we're kind of luckily gravitating away from the kind of stigmas of the past, but there's still a lot of it remains of like, well, I don't want to come across as weak, right? And in particular, I mean, there's definitely certain individuals or certain cultures that definitely are a little bit more tight-lipped about this type of stuff. So for me, at least, I find part of my job is to explain these things in a way that makes it make sense and goes beyond just kind of like what you would typically hear. So, part of my job is before we even get into, getting the actual work done and working on these kind of skills and strategies, it's getting someone to understand like what are we even doing and why is it important, right? Why is it
Right.
important and why is it going to be beneficial regardless of where you're at? I mean, there's people that we work with that are incredibly mentally tough and incredibly focused and resilient and confident and motivated. And there's people on the other end of that spectrum too. So this isn't necessarily a practice of you're bad at something that you want to fix. it's very much so, just the same. There's a lot of people that come into this very strong that, we just kind of work on those natural skill sets and stretch them even further. So part of the job is definitely getting the message across that, listen, wherever you're coming from in terms of background, culture, anything like that, there's nothing to be, there's nothing too daunting about this. It's really just another training system, training method, the same way that, you could be incredibly naturally talented, but you still go to your strength and conditioning classes because you want to maximize that. You still go to your technical trainings, you still spar, right? It's, well, what are we doing on the mental side? Probably not so much. So no matter where you are coming into something like this, there's a ton of places to grow and get value from it. So getting that message across too, that listen, it's not what you think it always is in terms of maybe being deficient at something that you want to add a skill set to. It could be something that you're great at that you want to kind of improve on. And that's totally a cool place to come at it from as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the issue of stigma, and I will get into that. And more importantly, it's, I think anyone who reaches out for any sort of help from a mental coach or a therapist, and there's a big distinction, of course, but in the interest of time here, we're strictly speaking about, performance coaching for combat sports. Huge value, and we'll explore that, I think, for high-level elite athletes, even recreational athletes, to speak to someone like yourself to kind of develop those strategies to deal with X, Y, and Z. We'll get into that, but before we do, I want to travel back in time to January 2014. You were featured in the Athlete of the Week television segment on on City News Toronto. You were being interviewed a few months prior to the Youth Olympic Game qualifiers in Taipei. Now, in the video, we see a very relaxed and confident 15-year-old demonstrating kicks and interacting with a reporter and a bunch of other practitioners at a Taekwondo gym. For context now, at that time, you had been active in combat sports for about a decade, since you started at the age of 5. My question for you is, knowing what you know now as a mental coach and looking back at that decade between the age of 5 and 15, for the developmental age of 5 to 15, what mental skills were being directly or indirectly developed via your participation in the sport of Taekwondo?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think martial arts, regardless of which one you kind of start with, I think traditional martial arts, at least, they do a great job at imposing like kind of like tenets, right? Like they call them like the tenets of Taekwondo or in karate. And it's very much so a lifestyle, right? So you learn from a young age to, have respect for your teachers and your masters and discipline and self-control, right? There's different kind of like pillars of the traditional side that come out. And I think starting at a young age in a more traditional martial art, it was important, right? To as a kid, be raised with those types of values. I mean, listen, my parents did a great job at raising me. Systems were great. Like I had no issues there, but it's different, right? Like when you're coming at it from like thousands of years old martial art and there's history there, like you learn in a different way. And I was always a lot more fearful of my masters than I was of like my teachers at school, right? Like if I was getting in trouble, my parents wouldn't be like, oh, we're going to call the principal. They're like, we're going to call your master. Like, no, don't do that. So from a young age, kind of instilling like the discipline and the self-control and that kind of like indomitable spirit, those were things that carried a long way. Even though I started at more of a recreational gym that wasn't geared for high performance, it really equipped me with a lot of those tools, at least kind of like behaviorally, that helped later on. And then, transitioning into competition, the ability to obviously set specific goals and at the beginning of the year kind of plan ahead for what you can expect and manage those expectations, so what success looks like, and being self-aware and being able to kind of journal after practice and write things down and keep notes after competitions and just kind of keep myself in check and develop that kind of self-awareness that you can use later on to better inform the decisions that you make. I mean, there's a lot of stuff I was doing really early on that played a role in my success as an athlete, and continues to play a role in my success and kind of what I'm doing now too.
Fascinating, man. Now, give us a kind of a brief summary of your competition history and achievement in the sport of Taekwondo, please.
Yeah. So I started when I was 5. My parents put me in Taekwondo, and like many traditional martial arts, a lot of these places aren't geared for competition. Like I talked about, a lot of it is just, get your belts, do your thing. But for me, like I always had a passion for sparring and competing, even though it wasn't something that I had a lot of access to. So, in 2011, I had the opportunity to switch gyms and find a new place, which was geared for, strictly kind of high performance and competition. And that's where I kind of took the jump to the next level. I mean, I had a black belt at the time, but I was not like at the level that a black belt should be. So I had a lot of kind of relearning to do, like technical and stuff like that. So my first week there at this new gym, it was called, or it's still there, it's called Authentic Taekwondo in Markham, back in the GTA. My first week there, this group of kids they were getting ready to go to nationals in Winnipeg, right?
Wow.
And they were like my age, and I was like, I was like, man, this is nuts. Like you're telling me like these kids that are like my age are like, they're going to get on a plane together. Like they're going to fly, they're going to represent like Team Ontario. And I was like, my mind was blown. And I was like, I want that. I was like,
You were
when's the
hooked.
next? That was it for me. Like I already knew I wanted to fight, but like seeing that, I was like, yeah, there's no way this isn't happening for me. So I was like, when's the next one? And it's like, okay, well, every year, right? Like, it was going to be next January. So I basically had a year to go from pretty much like zero on the technical ability standpoint to like being at that level to qualify for a tournament like that. And that's what I did. I mean, every month we were going to a different local tournament, in the area, and we were just fighting and getting those reps in. And fast forward to the end of the year, I ended up qualifying for nationals, flew out to Vancouver in 2012, January, and won gold there. So I, won my first gold medal at nationals in 2012. And kind of fast forwarding through the rest of my career, I was able to become multi-time national champion. I was named captain of Team Canada, so the national team in 2015, which was awesome. I was a back-to-back U.S. Open gold medalist, which was pretty cool because the U.S. Open is one of the biggest international tournaments for Taekwondo, and to win it once is like a really big milestone. So for me to win it back-to-back in 2014 and 2015 was like a pretty big accomplishment. I think I was one of the first Canadians to do it, which was really cool. Wow. And then, yeah, I think extending beyond there, I mean, world ranking wise, I held a ranking in the top 40 in the world for a long time. And that was as a kid. I mean, I was like 16, 17, 18 against, like 24, 25-year-olds. So, to hold a rank like that was pretty cool. And yeah, I would say that, right? Multi-time national champion, back-to-back US Open gold medalist, holding a world ranking in the top 40. So that's kind of what I was able to get out of my career. And, considering it only really lasted until I was about 18, 19, I think it was, did pretty well with it.
Right on. And I read recently that Taekwondo Canada, they published a news release saying that they announced a partnership with your company, MindLock. Just curious to know, tell us about this partnership and what it means for you personally, because you work with all sorts of athletes, not just combat sports athletes, right? But in this case, you have the opportunity to work with Team Canada, Taekwondo Canada, pardon me. And this is a sport, as you mentioned, you've been practicing since the age of 5. Well, what does this opportunity mean for you personally?
Yeah, it means a lot. Honestly, it's a really good kind of full circle moment. For me, I can attribute a lot of who I am to my experience through sport, right? The ups and the downs, and traveling across the world, and because of my experience in Taekwondo, I am the person that I am. So to be able to give back in that sense through a partnership is huge. And it comes a lot from personal experience. Like I was saying, I mean, traveling the world, representing Canada on some of the biggest stages, I was able to see how the best in the world train and compete and live and what their lifestyles are. And you notice things, right? You notice that all these national teams, they have their physiotherapists, they have their dietitians, they have their massage therapists. And the thing that I was always so confused about, I was like, where's the mental stuff? Like we say sport is so mental, but what are these elite teams doing about that? Not a lot. So even not just locally, but internationally, I was like, man, like, in Canada, we might not have like the biggest budget for stuff like that, but I mean, abroad, they definitely do. And to see that it was missing, it was always in the back of my head of like, this should change. So to be able to now be the person to bring this into, an NSO like Taekwondo Canada, it's massive, right? The opportunity, not just for, those members at Taekwondo Canada, but how this can expand abroad and throughout other NSOs in Canada and globally. I think it sets a really strong precedent of what we can expect in the future in terms of prioritizing and emphasizing mental skill development. And, to be the person that does that, it's a really cool moment for me, especially like we were talking about, my relationship with them and my history there. To be able to be the person to bring that over is it's a pretty cool achievement.
Yeah, it sounds like it, because as you mentioned, you were part of that culture, you were part of that team, and that's huge. You understand what these athletes are going through, physically, emotionally, so on and so forth, and that high pace of tournament-based competition. I'm sure, like you can sense the energy in the room. It's funny because I was watching UFC Fight Pass recently, just what was it, on Wednesday, last Wednesday, and you were cornering Vogel in his fight. And I was looking at you when you were in the corner, and I was wondering, I'm like, it's almost as if at that moment, it's like, for you as a former competitor in your sport, it's as if you were getting in the zone for real. Like, you were holding the belt, and I'm looking at it and I'm like, this guy is he's already made that sort of walk with it in a different sport, of course, but it's almost as if you were at home, you were coming back home. What and I know I'm just interpreting what I'm seeing here as a fight fan who watches probably too many fights. What was happening at that moment while you were holding that belt for Vogel and he was about to get into the cage? What was going through your mind?
Yeah, that was an amazing feeling, honestly. To be able to corner someone like that, especially a champion, kind of over on the other side of the country, kind of enemy territory. It was cool to kind of make that walk and, like you said, kind of hold the belt. And for me, it was for sure a very familiar feeling. It might have been my first time, at the BFL event with the belt, walking behind the champion, but it was not my first time walking into the ring, right? I've had hundreds of fights, on all different levels, from local to international and abroad. So like you were saying, it's a very comfortable feeling to walk out there with the cheers and the boos and the lights and just, kind of soaking in that moment. And I for sure felt the same way. I mean, I wasn't the one that, this time was walking into the ring to fight, but I for sure felt like I was going into war with Mateo. As part of the corner, I mean, it's a very unique relationship to be able to do that, right? Not everybody gets to do it. Very few get to be able to make that walk. I mean, it's one thing to send a text the morning of saying, hey, good luck, hope you do great. But to make that walk in there with them in an extremely stressful and nerve-wracking and obviously exciting moment, it's unique. And it for sure kind of brought back those feelings of me standing in the ring, holding the belt up. I was looking right at his opponent and kind of making that eye contact and trying to show him that he could feel kind of all of us at the same time, right? Because it's an individual sport, of course, but it's a team dynamic, it's a team atmosphere, right? So I wanted the opponent to feel the weight of all of us in his corner, and to know what went into this prep, what went into this camp. And for me, in that standpoint, any little edge makes the difference. So, his opponent may have been visualizing the walkout 100 times. What he wasn't going to expect was me being out there as well. So to throw that little curveball of like, hey man, this looks a little bit different than what you pictured, was kind of my way of adding a little bit to the performance there. But at the same time, it was totally authentic. I mean, for me, walking from up top all the way into the ring, it was a great feeling. And like you said, it felt like I was walking out there to fight too, and to be able to support him in that moment was massive.
Yeah, it was visually, it was brilliant, because there you have the grappling coach, the MMA striking coach, and then the mental coach as well. What a support staff, and what a crew of people there standing in support of Vogel. Curious to know now, kind of tell us, why do clients seek your help and professional input? What's the expected outcome, and what should they expect when they come and seek you for professional assistance?
Yeah, it's a great question. In short, you ask someone a question of it, and I'll ask you. I mean, it obviously sounds like you're experienced and well versed in watching fights and stuff like that. I mean, what would you say if I were to ask you, how much of performance is mental versus physical, right? Percentage wise. Now, again, there's no right answer, so don't worry about that. It's just an opinion thing. But if you had to put a percentage on mental versus physical, the impact on performance, what would you say?
Wow, I think it's all mental, especially for elite level competitors. I think for people who are in extremely good shape, who are very strong, very fit. They've got everything else going for them. They know what they're doing, respective of their sport. At the end of the day, the ultimate determining factor, in my humble opinion, just as a fan, it's all the mind, where you're at and how you're feeling, and if you're good to go and ready. Because I mean, that's the central operating system. That's everything. If you're feeling like depressed, if you're feeling low energy, I mean, if you can't get yourself into your zone respectively, I mean, it's 99%. Sorry, I'm going off on a rant there.
Yeah. And listen, like I said, there's people listening that are going to agree with you and say it's 99. There's people that might say it's 70, 60, 50, whatever. Let's be very conservative and call it 50-50, right? Very conservative. The question is, what are we doing about that? What are we doing about it, right? You look at the other 50%, the physical. Well, okay, you have your strength and conditioning coach, you have your technical, you do your sparring, you have your diet, you try to sleep on time, you take your supplements, right? All of the work that we do as competitors, regardless of what sport we're doing, most of it goes into the physical preparation. So when you understand the discrepancy, I mean, that's why people work with somebody like me, is because they understand that there's a huge discrepancy between the impact that the mental game has on our performance compared to the emphasis that we put on developing those mental skills, right? There's a huge gap there, a huge discrepancy. And what that leads to is this vulnerability and this tendency to underperform. Because when a gap like that exists, right, when there's a gap between the impact of the mental game on our performance and the emphasis we put on developing the mental game, there's a tendency to underperform. And what underperformance looks like is not always even losing, but it's feeling like you could have done more. It's feeling like, man, that wasn't me at my best out there. I could have done a little bit better. It's that feeling of not really performing to the best of your potential. And, 9 times out of 10, you can trace that back to something on the mental side. So everybody in this day and age is doing similar stuff. Everybody spars hard. Everybody has a strength and conditioning coach. Everybody has a dietitian that they work with to figure out their weight cuts. At a high level, it's the small variations that are going to make the biggest impact, right? You look at a title fight. There's not going to be a huge discrepancy in technical ability. There's not going to be a huge discrepancy in cardio. There's not going to be a huge discrepancy in all these other things. For me, at least, it's the mindset variable. It's the mental variable that makes the biggest difference, right? Not even just throughout the fight, but throughout the fight week, throughout the camp, right? There's going to be moments that cause you problems. How do you respond to that? Right? When you walk out and the crowd starts to boo or they start to cheer, or you forgot your shorts, at home and you have to wear a teammate shorts that you didn't prepare for, anything, right? It a lot of the time comes down to something mental that can make a huge impact. And when the stakes are high and the competition level is at its greatest, it's that small variable of the mental game that makes a huge difference. And that's why we work with athletes. That's why athletes come to work with us, is because we train them on how to develop the mental skills and strategies that are required to have a high performance output on a consistent basis for a long period of time. And as an athlete, what more could you want?
I know the scope of this interview is focused on athletes and combat sports athletes, but I think in my humble opinion, a lot of what you're sharing also applies to all sorts of people as well, professionals, if it's, I don't know, accountants, lawyers, whatever that may be, even customer service reps, right? There's a lot of value there in terms of knowing how to deal with stress, knowing how to not underperform, as you mentioned, and give your best. Curious to know, and I know you've kind of spoken about it a bit. I want to dive in a bit deeper. Give us a brief overview of your methodology. How do you assess and mentally coach athletes?
Yeah. So for me, what I try to do is I try to take kind of bigger, broader, more abstract concepts and really break them down into tools that can be used to make an impact right away. I think sometimes people think mental coaching or mindset and they think really long term, right? And of course, the longer you do something like this, the more benefit you'll have. But by no means do you need to be waiting 6 months to feel something, right? The way I try to package it is very tangible, very hands-on. And, within the first couple of sessions, noticing instantaneous changes is important. So the way that it works is, when we work with an athlete, typically it's done kind of online through video call, like a Skype or FaceTime or something like that. And we'll go through, we have kind of like a curriculum of activities and assessments and worksheets that we like to kind of go through that, kind of helps provide those tools. But at the same time, a lot of flexibility in terms of understanding, like, how's the week going? How did training go? What worked really well that you wanted to lean into? What didn't work so great that we can make adjustments for? So I try to follow an approach of like high structure, high flexibility. So like high structure in terms of there's always a plan for what we do, but high flexibility in terms of we can always deviate from that depending on what's going on. So we might go through an exercise on, high performance goal setting, for example. And for, in that exercise, you may have listed out a few of your training goals for the week. And you say, for practice this week, I want to emphasize A, B, and C. Well, then you have the opportunity to actually try that out and execute that throughout the week. So you can take the time and you can work on applying those specific deliberate training goals. And then the next time we talk, we'll talk about, okay, how did it go? Right? You set those goals, what worked, what didn't work, why, and break it down. So the value of the work doesn't just come from, the one-on-one time in the session, but it's extended into your week. It's extended into training. There's always an element that kind of keeps you in the zone throughout. And it's not just a matter of when we're talking, we're on, and, when we're not talking, there's nothing there. There's always kind of work being done behind the scenes. And that's kind of the structure, just kind of working on a consistent basis through, all of those lenses, building up these mental skills and being able to create something, a skill set, really the way that we create skill sets and all the other things that we do, but on the mental side. So when you go out there and compete, you can be confident that you're competing, as the best version of yourself.
Very interesting. I want to go back, Dylan, to earlier on. You were talking about some stigmas with people looking to, to improve their mental focus. And I was curious to know, now we know that there's stigma when it comes towards seeking help for mental health, right? Unfortunately, there's a lot of that stigma, when people are looking for any form of help. And on top of that, we know that for athletes, mental health, especially elite level high performers, it's a big mountain to climb. It's a big issue. In addition to that, just as a quick aside, a few years ago, I remember doing a lot of like local reporting on gyms in town here in Ottawa, Gatineau. And I remember one of the underlying themes that I kept coming up, one way or another, that wasn't fully explored was mental health, in the sense that people train obviously to feel better, right? But there's always more as to one story as to why they get involved in certain activities. And particularly, I think there's a huge correlation between combat sports and mental health. I think that there's a lot there to explore. Irregardless of that, I just want to go back to the topic of stigma when it comes to seeking performance coaches. Where do you think that stigma stems from?
It's a really good question. I think you could probably trace it back to a bunch of things, right? As athletes, we want to be seen as dominant. We want to be seen as strong, and sometimes being a part of something like this might seem counteractive to that, right? If you're a fighter in particular, like you want to be this like scary person, you might worry, well, what's it going to look like if I'm working with a mental coach, right? Is it going to look like I have problems? Like I said at the beginning, there's no reason to see it that way. I think it's a reason to be even more confident. I think we should be showing it off the same way that we show off hard rounds in the gym and strength and conditioning sessions. It's like, I'm more scared of the person that really works on developing kind of their mindset in a very deliberate and specific way than someone that's just kind of naturally tough. The way I like to frame it is like, just because you're great at something doesn't mean that you don't train it. It's like if Floyd Mayweather said, I'm a good boxer, so I don't have to show up to boxing class. It's like, no, like, even if you're the very best in the world at something, it's even more reason to challenge yourself in different ways and to stretch that out and to take this kind of natural skill set that you have and double down on it. But anyway, going back to what you were saying of the stigma and where it comes from, I think, listen, this is not as new an industry as it may seem. There's not a lot of maybe popular brands in this space or names that you can think of right away, but this isn't as new as it sounds. The problem is that this has typically been run by a group of or a system of kind of professors who teach this stuff and then part-time kind of consult with athletes, right? And because it's coming from that dynamic, the problem that I've seen is it becomes very kind of like hush hush, right? It's put in the corner. It's like if you're working with someone like that, you don't necessarily want to tell people. And I think it's a systems issue. I think there's a lot of rules. I think there's a lot of there's not a lot of flexibility there. It's very traditional, right? So, for example, there's rules you have to follow. Like if you're a psychologist or you're a therapist, there's rules that you have to kind of play within, and I think sometimes it can be detrimental. So, for example, I don't think that there's a psychologist or a therapist that could walk into the ring with someone. Like I don't know if that violates like some rule that they have, right?
Right,
For
right.
me, I'll have an athlete texting me at midnight because they're cutting weight and they want to talk about it. That's cool with me, right? It's that flexibility, it's that kind of non-traditionalness that I can do because of who I am that I may have not been able to if I was bound by these limitations. So I think the history of sports psychology as a practice, I think it stems from a lot of these kind of older professors that part-time consult with athletes but like to teach, and it's created this kind of old school mentality that almost feeds into the stigma. So for me as a young, I mean, look at me, I don't look like the typical person like that. So for me to come in as a younger person, as a former athlete, I feel like it's part of my mission to make this popular. Like that's a big part of what I want to do is not just, work with athletes, obviously, and generate, a lot of success for them, but to change the way that we even think about mental training. I want people to think about mental training as something that's cool, something that they want to show off, something to be proud of. Right. And, even till now, I'll run a session with someone and they'll post something on their story. And it's just for me, like, that's what I love to see because we're slowly changing the narrative. And I feel a responsibility to do that coming at this from the lens and from the view that I have is not just having kind of success for myself, but really changing the landscape when it comes to how we even see mental training. So that's kind of my mission in terms of taking away from or gravitating away from the stigma that's been there in the past from kind of the founders of this type of stuff and put more of a modern spin on it. So that's kind of what I'm doing to shift the narrative a little bit.
Fascinating as you're shifting the narrative and you're making it more accessible to potentially a whole new generation of athletes, young folks like yourself. And it's interesting too, because you're right, it's not a new thing, it's been around. In fact, do you remember the 90s? Well, I do. I remember
Yeah.
the 90s. There was a huge movement in the US along the theme of like personal motivation. Do you remember Tony Robbins, I believe it was,
Yeah.
with Awakening the Giant or whatever. And I believe one example is he ended up coaching a lot of professional football teams, basketball teams, tennis players, and so on motivation and aspects of what it is that you're doing. So you're right, it's not necessarily new, but you're accessing it. And it's interesting just hearing you as you were talking about that. It sounds like you've tapped into something really interesting, and you have your own value proposition for it. You're coming at it from, as you mentioned, as a young person. And I'm not saying that from an ageist perspective, you know what I'm saying? Because I'm sure some people will be like, oh, what does this young person know about mental focus and so on? Well, you've been an athlete for more than 20 years. Like, how old are you? 20 something?
Yeah, it was my birthday 2 weeks ago. I just turned 24.
24. So you've been active in martial arts for the bulk of your life. So, I mean, that's, over 10,000 hours of practice. I think as Malcolm Gladwell's book, he's talking about 10,000 hours for personal development and achieving success. I want to transition from the topic of stigma, because I'll just say this. I think anyone who seeks any coach that can assist them on their mindset is someone who takes themselves and their athletic endeavor extremely serious. There's no stigma there, and on the flip side, and I know anyone who seeks help for any mental health challenge or illness is doing themselves a favor. I think stigma needs to be addressed head on if one is open to that journey. I want to know, you deal with all sorts of athletes, right? All sorts of individuals, different backgrounds, competing in various sports. Now, my question is, and it's a tough one. What key characteristics do you think enhance an athlete's ability to be highly effective, confident, and focused? What are those characteristics from your experience?
I think a big one, I think a huge one is the ability or the willingness to take risks when you can. There's times to take risks and there's times not to, obviously. A big example of a time to take a risk is in training, right? Regardless of sport, you can use training as an incredible tool to develop, but at the same time, it's very easy to kind of fall into this autopilot mode, right? And not for anybody's fault. I mean, when you train, you look at whether you're an amateur or a pro athlete, the hours that go into training are huge, right? And with that type of repetition is going to come this feeling of kind of like clocking in and clocking out or going through the motions and that feeling of being on autopilot. So one thing that you can do as an athlete to kind of instantly make a change is to be very, very deliberate, very intentional with what you're doing with that class, right? Not just to show up because it's a 7 o'clock on a Wednesday and that's what you do, it's part of your schedule, but why are you specifically there today, right? What are you looking to develop? When is your next event? What can you do in this specific training session to help you kind of get closer to that? So being very deliberate with your time and trying to turn off that autopilot mode and being okay to take risks, right? The way that I see it is you can either, be the biggest fish in a small pond and, play it safe in the gym and, beat everybody up and have a good time and be vulnerable when it comes time to competing because of that. Or you're vulnerable in the gym. You're not afraid to lose. You're not afraid to try new things and fail. But what that does is it provides you with the confidence and the strength that you need and the advanced skill set when the competition comes around to actually like be dominant there. So I think a lot of people could benefit from kind of the reminder that, hey, you're not supposed to be perfect in practice. There's no such thing. No one like monitors your record. Like there's no record in sparring in the gym. So you might as well lose there. You might as well take risks and battle adversity and deal with different challenges because that's where all the learning happens that you can use to your advantage when it comes time to compete. So that's definitely a major thing is be okay with risks, especially when the context kind of supports it, such as training. Use training as an actual tool, not just as a way to kind of stay sharp and validate what you already know about yourself.
In terms of coaching, where do you see, so, any sport, really, any combat sports, whatever, what value does understanding how an athlete is motivated, understanding the psychology of the sports psychology of sports, how does that enhance a coach's ability to coach? And the reason why I ask that quickly is I wonder, when you work with clients, do you ever remedy the situation by almost talking to the coach and also coaching the coach as to how one should coach, especially if there's potential conflicts? And I don't mean conflicts like, people, the student doesn't like the coach or something like that, but like in your assessment, you realize that maybe the root cause of this athlete's lack of confidence might be due to the coach or something like that. Do you see where I'm going? So the question is, like, do you ever find yourself in a situation where you have to address an issue with the coach just to change their coaching style?
I mean, at the end of the day, in a perfect situation, there's going to be transparency all around. There's going to be transparency between me, athlete, coach. And if that can be like a really solid relationship, that's obviously going to be best. But in a lot of cases, it's just not realistic, depending on kind of different restraints. But like you were saying, as a coach, it's a very, very tough job. And I think it's a tougher job than what people might imagine because you're responsible for so many different types of personalities, right? So as a coach, you might think, this is our system, this is our way, it's been proven, you either fit the mold or you don't, right? Problem is people sometimes people just need a little bit of a different style to that, right? It could be the same message you're trying to convey, but maybe a little bit of a different interpretation could go a long way. So as a coach, you have to be very flexible in terms of how do I get my point across to person A and person B. It might have to be a little bit different. It doesn't mean that your message is changing. You could have the same style, the same approach and everything, but how you get that across is different, right? Some people like to be yelled at, like that's how they're motivated. They get fired up. It's like you yell at them, you hype them up. Some people, it's like way too intimidating and they need more of a softer approach, right? So you can't look at one of those people and say you're right and you're wrong. It's just they're different. How do I mold my coaching style to each person, right? How do I kind of make it more intense for one person, cool it off a little bit for another while still getting the same message across? So a lot of what we'll do is kind of have those open line of communication with athletes and with the coaches of, hey, what's the point that we're trying to get across here, and how can we get this done the most effectively, right? Or what's going to work for this athlete in particular? Maybe it's a specific style, maybe it's a few kind of sets of words that are really powerful for that athlete. Maybe it's something that they like. It's a dynamic. Some athletes like to be really kind of chill and relax and buddy buddy with their coach. Some athletes like a bit of a barrier and more of that traditionalness. So it's never about changing the coach or their style. It's more about how do we apply it in the right way contextually to that athlete. So for example, even a personal example, to show how powerful something is as simple as words can be. For me, when I was competing, there was a time where my coach would always tell me to be patient, right? Be fighting, you say, Dylan, be patient, be patient. Problem is I was interpreting that the wrong way, and I was being way too cautious, and I wasn't active enough. Opportunity would pass, another one would pass, another one would pass, and I'm like, okay, I'm being patient, but like, like I want to do something, and it didn't work for me. I knew what he was trying to tell me, but the word patience, just the connotation didn't work. So I told him afterwards, hey, I know what you're trying to say. I'm not responding well to it. Can you tell me instead to be selective? Because for me, the word selective means not biting on everything, but when I see an opportunity, I'm going to take it, right? It gives me the freedom to jump on what I see, but it also reminds me to kind of not take everything that's given, right? So the smallest shift from Dylan, be patient to Dylan, be selective, right away made a huge impact on my game. I was able to start rounds strong, take advantage of opportunities, follow up on those opportunities, and it made a huge difference with one word.
Right.
Now, if I was scared to say that and say, I don't want to tell my coach what to do, he's the boss, he has
Right.
all this experience, where would we get? I wouldn't have the performance I'm capable of having, and he'd be frustrated with me because he knows what I'm capable of doing. So the opportunity to say, hey, I think you're great. I know exactly what you're trying to tell me. Here's what I think could be a little bit better, made a huge impact. And I think if we can feel comfortable approaching our coaches and having that dialogue, I think we're going to come to a much better conclusion. And it doesn't take away the respect. It's not like I know better than my coach does, I'm going to tell him how to coach me. But again, you have to understand everybody's coached a little bit differently. So adding a little bit of that personalness of like, hey, here's how it could be better for me. It helps everybody. It helps you out as the athlete because you're getting what you want, and it helps the coach out because they don't have to guess. You're telling them exactly how they need to say what they need to say to support you, and it makes everybody's job easier.
Fascinating example, man. And I even, as you were explaining the keyword patient versus selective, right? I kind of went on that ride, and I just, in terms of interpreting what patience would mean to me versus selective, and it's yeah, it's fascinating when you're customizing keywords for individuals so that they ensure that they interpret it correctly, and you're talking about that open line of communication between the coach and the athletes, which is integral. Now, you've worked with Canadian MMA athletes like Matteo Vogel, the current BFL featherweight champion of the world. What's it like working with him and other talented and driven mixed martial artists?
So Mateo is a great example of somebody that is incredibly mentally tough, right? Mateo is a tough individual. He's disciplined, he's dedicated, and I think it goes to show, how a program like this can benefit anybody. Like I said, this isn't just for somebody that comes in and they're insecure and they're not motivated and they struggle. Of course, there's ways to benefit that, and there's a ton of room to grow. But Mateo is a good example of someone that comes into this with an incredible natural kind of mental skill set, and how we can use that foundation to add even more to it, right? It's how do we take that foundation of toughness and build on it and add specific things to it. So when you go out there, you're not just the version of you that you kind of always were, but you're a better version because of the stuff that you did prior to it. So being able to sit with him and go through, short little exercises and activities and visualizations, before he had to go out there and compete was massive, right? But again, it's a dynamic. It's his willingness to be able to learn and understand and communicate and welcome those different things. And the dynamic meshes really well. So, you see people that are at the top of their game, that's their mindset, right? Mateo could very easily say, I'm the champ, I'm the best in the division, save a mental coach for somebody else who really needs it, right? But the way that he sees is like, no, like any competitive edge that I have access to, I will use, because that's what champions do. Champions don't settle for what's just working. They push the envelope and they continue to grow fight after fight after fight. And I think that's what has made Mateo so successful until this moment. And I think that's what's going to continue to drive his success into the future, is because of that kind of never say die attitude, that willingness to grow, that willingness to expand and never settle, regardless of how dominant his reign has been so far. And that's, I think, goes to show what he's meant for in this division and in this sport.
Now, I have 10 more minutes left with you. I really appreciate this interview. It's been very interesting for me. I'm as you can tell, I'm fascinated by the topic. I want to know, in terms of professional development and furthering your craft, how do you keep up with the quote unquote latest research and strategies for peak performance? What are you reading? What podcasts are you listening to?
Yeah, I tend to like the podcast I listen to, I like to listen to more like business development stuff. There's a couple of people. I mean, Gary Vee is someone that I like to listen to. Alex Ramosi. I mean, these are guys that have kind of built really big things and understand scale and understand how to not only kind of prioritize business development, but also honor the customer and the product. And I think that's a dynamic that I think is important in any service industry, right? You obviously want to further the development of the business and of the brand, but at the same time, you're nothing without the trust and the support of the people that you work with, right? So it's finding that balance of moving along, and trying to build something, but also taking care of the real thing that matters, which is like the product, right? Without that, it doesn't matter how big you get. If you're not delivering on what you say you're going to, there's a problem there, right? I try to comb through LinkedIn and look at different kind of psychologists and what their theories are and what people are coming out with. Again, like I said, it's a very kind of traditional space, and I try to do my part in kind of making my own line and doing it my own way. So maybe less than the next person. I don't really indulge too much in trying to keep up with everything that everyone else is doing. I try to do my own thing and do it right and learn from myself. I think that's always better. Is how have my sessions gone? How are my athletes developing, and learn from those. What am I doing that's working great that I want to double down on? What am I doing that could use some improvements that I want to kind of be creative and find a new alternative to? So I try to just kind of do my own thing and follow my own path, because there isn't really anybody that I'm looking to copy in that sense. So I'm just, I do my thing, and I always try to keep my eyes open for, successes in the space and to see what I can use to apply to myself. But yeah, it's a mix of kind of general understanding from other people, more specific kind of sports and psychology related stuff. But for the most part, trying to just learn from myself and go on that pace and keep it up as best as I can.
Now, I have two more questions for you, and this one's general in a sense. How do you measure success, and how do you know when you've gotten through to an athlete that's potentially challenging to work with?
Yeah, I think defining success is a very important thing that sounds simple, but I think it's underutilized, right? Even like you said, how do you define success? Well, you have to define it, right? That's the first step. You look at a fight camp, for example. You look at, let's be even more specific, like the last week of a fight camp. Well, guess what? How do you think you're gonna feel? You're at the end of your weight cut. You've been in a camp for 6 weeks. You're exhausted. You're burnt out. There's no way that you can expect the same output in week 7 as you did in week 1 or 2, right? Problem is, without that kind of explicit definition of success, people get really disappointed in themselves. Like, man, I suck this week. I can barely lift my legs and this and that, and I'm so out of it. But guess what? Like, did you expect anything different? I mean, it's the last week of camp, right? So the first step is defining success. Is what does success this week for you look like? Is it just showing up and just getting it done, right? Like if it's an hour, being there for the hour, not quitting. Is it dominating every round that you do? Is it trying to map out your game plan for the fight and impose that on your different training partners? Are you looking for a specific sequence? So the first step is actually just actively defining what success looks like, right? Because success and kind of like what you should be striving for is different, right? Like a successful week of training in week 7 of fight camp is going to look very different than a successful week of training in week 1 or 2. But if you're not actively changing that definition, you're just going to resort to what your original kind of expectations are, and you're going to be disappointed. So that's the first step, is actively defining, what does success look like, and how do you know when you get there, right? Does it look like having high energy, high output? Does it look like just finishing the week without quitting? Sometimes that's what it is, right? And for me, on a general level, like if you take a big step back and we look at just overall career success, I've always defined that as the ability to go out there and feel like you've fulfilled your potential as an athlete or as an individual. For me, like I said, transitioning from a recreational gym to a high performance club, I knew I had something in me. I didn't know how far I could take it, right? So when my coach had asked me, when I sat down on my first day, he said, Dylan, what are your goals in this sport, right? And I said, listen, I thought about it. And I said, I just want to be the best Dylan I could possibly be. I said, whether that takes me to the provincial level, the national level, to the Olympics, I don't care. I just want to be, I felt like I had this thing in me that I wouldn't be satisfied until I knew what it was. And I really kind of squeezed everything out of it. And to me, that is a lot more impactful and powerful than any results. You could say, I'm successful when I'm a world champion. I'm successful when I'm a national champion. I'm successful when I'm this rank. Yeah, but those are results, right? And results come from our performance, and they're just kind of extra things, right? Like outcomes aren't necessarily goals, they're just outcomes, right? So when you attach success and you attach your self-worth to your outcomes, there's sometimes a clash there. So it's more important to tie it to your performance, right? I'm successful when my performance gets to a point where I feel like this is me at my best. I'm at my peak. I've fulfilled the full potential that I have in this sport or in this domain that I choose to deploy my skills against. And I think that's what real true fulfillment and satisfaction and success is. It's when you feel like you've really maxed out on your potential and you're at your best. And I don't think there's a feeling like it.
Wow. One last question for you. That answer there, I think we could probably explore for another hour, because it's something that maybe in this culture, it's not something, I'm generalizing here, folks, when I say in this culture, but it's not something that's fully exercised or explored. You know how you say, like, to squeeze the juice, all of it right out, and to get the most out of oneself and their performance. It's fascinating. What's the best advice you've ever been given in life and sport, if I could ask you that?
It's a good question. I'm sure I'll say an answer, and then 10 minutes from now I'll probably think, there's something else. But there's one that sticks with me. It comes from my coach. So a lot of my development came from my coach. His name is he's Master Akmal Farah, out in Toronto. He was my Taekwondo coach, former national team coach as well. And he was really like my second dad for a lot of the time, because we were spending all this time together more than I would at home. Like, I mean, especially in high school, we were training 3 times a day, right? We were training like 7 to 8 in the morning, and then, 3 to 5 after school, and then, 7 to 9 at night. So, I would wake up and I'd see my parents for like, I don't know, 30 minutes in the morning for breakfast. And then I'd see them at night at like 10 o'clock before I went to bed. But I was spending most of my time with him and with my team. We were traveling. So a lot of what I've learned in terms of my development came from him. One simple thing, so simple, he used to always say to us was just do the right things, right? Do the right things, whether it's in the ring, outside of the ring, in life. The way he framed it was, listen, what the right things are. You're experienced, you've trained hard, you've been in there, you've hundreds of fights. Do the right things. And from a specific standpoint, what that means is, okay, we're fighting. I know that I need to manage my distance well. I know I need to keep my hands up. I know that when I see someone come in with a back leg kick, I know that there's going to be an opening on the other side, right? I know that when I close the distance, I have some room there. So it's just like, do the right things. Don't overthink it, right? And such a simple concept, but for me, it always just made a big impact because of how simple it was. And it reminded me that, like, intuitively, we have the answers, right? We know we don't need to do so much seeking out, and you could spend hours and hours and years, trying to figure out the perfect way. But we know, and you need to honor your own experience. Of course, you want to be able to seek out help from other people and advice, but we know for the most part what those right things are. So when you said that, it was impactful to me, which is just do the right things, whether it's in the ring and it's, fight style and strategy wise, whether it's outside and it's lifestyle and it's training and it's, showing up and being consistent, do the right things. And for me, that's always been something as a message that carried with me.
That's an awesome message, man. Thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate this conversation. We were joined here by Dylan Nadler from MindLock. Make sure you follow him on social media. Thank you very much, man. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it, man. Take it easy.
Cheers.